Good afternoon. Welcome back to the fellows and other participants here in Barcelona. Welcome to all of you who are tuning into the live stream. I'm so glad that you're with us, and especially to those of you who are in Doha, and we wish that we could be there with you. This panel has to do with AI and changing understandings of humanity. I'm Paul Eli, a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. And as my colleague Jose Casanova suggested, the qualification for the moderators to be the one on the panel who knows the least about the subject. And I'm something like a virgin when it comes to AI, but I'll try to regard that as an advantage. Much of the current debate around AI centers rightly on its implications for the economy and for job displacement in particular. At a more fundamental level, though, the explosion of human-machine interaction raises questions about what it means to be a human. What remains and will remain distinctive about human intelligence, creativity, and community in an AI-infused world? Does AI pose an existential threat? And if so, how? Now, I note that there, and in many other contexts, it's now called AI on first reference, rather than artificial intelligence. And the reason I suspect, or I like to think, is that we know that it's not really intelligence, and that it doesn't really belong to the realm of artifice, of artificers as we've understood them, of art. I myself try not to use the term. I don't know nearly enough about it, but I'm beginning to shape a piece of thought and writing in which I call it not artificial intelligence, but algorithmic imitation, or MDM, massive data mimicry. It's essentially imitative, and it risks rendering us all mimic men. Or so I think and fear, just as I'm setting out in my own exploration of MDM, or algorithmic imitation. But the panelists have their own views, and so let's hear them. Moksin, you'll explore, or set off at least, by touching on the qualities of attention and what that means with this application in mind. Nicoletta, physicality and what that meant for our human communication and what that might mean with this new technology at hand. Kohei, you're the early adopter, and you can testify to that experience, at least as a setting off point. I'm so eager to hear what you have to say. Let's go.
Hello, everyone, and hello, hopefully, to Tom, if you're watching from DC, much missed, and to Safwan and everybody in Doha. We're thinking of you all. This is a piece that I wrote for this panel. I'm not used to doing interventions where I've written a piece, but I'm going to read this in any case. Like many of my fellow writers, I have noticed that my ability to read and write fiction appears to be declining. With effort, though, I can still manage. I'm not unlike an aging weightlifter performing a deadlift. I must first create space in my life for the attempt, find my way to the gym despite the many demands on my time. Once there, I warm up thoroughly, focus, reach deep within myself. Then I pull with utter determination and commitment. Finally, mercifully, I experience the satisfaction of iron again rising in my hands. My strength, it seems, is still there, but accessing it is no longer easy, can no longer be taken for granted, and my recovery is not what it was. I wait longer than I previously did before I return to the gym for another attempt. I have been a novel reader for almost half a century, a novel writer for well over 3 decades. So I'm acutely aware of the changes in myself as a writing being, as a reading being. I'm also aware of similar changes in the people around me. Long-form writing and long-form reading require something important of us, attention that is sustained, supple, focused, volitional, and imaginative. This literary mode of attention is a manifestation of what is most distinctive about human beings. Our ability to engage co-creatively, at length, with our own thoughts, as though they were separate from ourselves, and with the thoughts of others, as though they were separate from those others. But attempting to access such a mode of co-creation, whether as a writer or as a reader, is also to place oneself in direct conflict with one of the dominant forces in our present economic structure, which is the ongoing contest for and consequent fragmentation of our attention. It is often suggested these days that our culture's emphasis on reading and writing has peaked and is now receding, that we are reverting to a culture rooted more fully in orality. This is a dangerous development. Orality, our original form of engaging with thoughts expressed in words, is of course very powerful. But we created written text for a reason. Reading and writing have advantages over orality, not merely in how they allow our thoughts to live outside our bodies, but also in how they allow us to tinker with those thoughts, to play with those thoughts, and, if we wish, to do so unseen in our own minds, without the effects of performing for others. As our attentional ability to engage with lengthy and complicated texts declines, a vital aspect of human power, the ability to wrestle with ideas, declines too. Our historical moment is one in which the notion of artificial intelligence is ascendant. AI is, of course, a branding term. It is unclear, at least to me, if AI is or ever can be truly intelligent in the sense of operating from an embodied view of the world, of the self, and of others. I also suspect that the valuations of AI firms might be far less astronomical were they simply called software companies. That said, neither the machine gun nor the printing press needed to be intelligent in order to change the world. We are clearly in an era where the exponential growth of algorithms, data availability, and compute are upending the workings of human society. Perhaps it is as silly for us to quibble over terminology around the phrase artificial intelligence as it might be for dinosaurs looking up at an approaching asteroid to quibble about what the term extinction event means. As we know, dinosaurs did not quite go extinct. Their avian forms continued as birds. Something similar is now on offer to humanity by technologists and oligarchs, for us to not quite go extinct, but to continue as biological machines. This proposed machinification of humans is depicted as evolutionary, which is to say both inevitable and desirable. But it is not inevitable, and for many of us it is not particularly desirable either, and so our acquiescence to it must be manufactured. This manufacturing process rests on two main assertions. First, that our essence can best be understood as machine-like, and second, that our potential can best be achieved through submitting ourselves to the machine whisperers among us. This model is, of course, a quasi-religious one, paralleling the notion that human beings can best be understood in relationship with the divine and should therefore submit themselves to those who have knowledge of the divine. In and of itself, though, the machinification of humans would be a rather dry offering. It requires mystery to be more compelling. And that mystery is provided by a mirroring strand, by the humanization of machines. We are being told that machines can think, can come to know us, can perhaps one day transcend us, or even love us. The machine in the world of AI is not merely a complex mimic and sorting system that can predict a desirable output. It is instead something magical, something mystical, something akin to what we once imagined humans to be, something with a soul, with a divine purpose. All of this, the machinification of humans and the humanization of machines, is a form of storytelling. And yet it is a form of storytelling that is dumbed down and riddled with holes. It functions best when our capacity for attention has been undermined, when we struggle, for example, with our ability to enter modes such as the literary one, which is not to say, much though I might wish to, that the novel is the enemy of tech oligarchy, but rather is simply to note that the decline in the ability to write and read novels is indicative of an attentional diminishment that is an ally of tech oligarchy. We could, of course, choose to think of humans as biological machines, but it does not follow that we should. Similarly, we could imagine human qualities onto machines, but again, why on earth should we? What might humanity gain from doing so? Both of these directives are, at their core, about empathy, about shifting our empathy away from our fellow humans and other living creatures and towards machines, in favor of a world dominated by machines and their owners. We are being told, in economic terms, to blur our awareness of the distinction between labor, humans, and capital, machines, a blurring of awareness that functions to dissolve the solidarity of the former to the benefit of the latter. We can see all around us the consequences of this simultaneous machinification of humans and humanization of machines. Fertility rates are collapsing below replacement level in country after country. Global efforts to eliminate extreme poverty are slipping into reverse. Migrants and people of minority religions and ethnicities are being demonized. Wars are breaking out in Africa, Europe, and Southwest Asia. It seems we lack only the spark of a battle in the Pacific to tip us fully into World War III. And all this is happening while concentrations of wealth reach new extremes, with a handful of tech billionaires groping their way towards the status of humanity's first trillionaire. Our species is clearly struggling to thrive. This is not solely due to the rise of AI, nor to continued technological progress, but it might be related to these changes. It might be because we are not developing ourselves into the kinds of humans able to flourish amidst expanding roles for AI and machines. If we are to reverse this failure, if we are to empower human beings to benefit from our emerging technological capacities, we will likely need to do the opposite of what we have been doing. We will need to protect, reconstitute, and expand our capacities for attention. Attention is becoming a human currency on par with money in significance. So we must begin to think of its availability, distribution, and expansion with the same rigor that we bring to our thinking about money. We ought to educate children in attention, to develop ongoing improvements for adults in attention, and to regulate corporate attempts to trap, undermine, and diminish attention. We should not accept as natural a predicament where we struggle to access the literary mode of attention, where reading and writing long-form texts are increasingly beyond our abilities. Instead, we should seek not just to maintain, but to far exceed this mode of attention, to achieve states where writing and reading novels are in fact not ceilings in our attentional capacities, but rather floors, with new ceilings being activities that are far more attentionally demanding. A human life tends to follow a certain arc, one of growth in capacity and then of diminishment. A writer who once accessed the literary mode of attention easily might be expected, even without technological change, to find doing so more difficult later in life, just as a weightlifter might be expected to find the same weight heavier later in life. But this should not be the case for humanity as a species. The rise of AI is not the chief threat to our well-being. The diminishment of the human in the time of AI is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsin. And it makes me want to be more attentive hearing you speak. Nicoletta?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Mohsin, for your very inspiring piece. As I was telling you earlier, reading your reflections, I was really struck by the recurring motif of physicality in your argumentation. When you described, and I'm quoting you, the satisfaction of iron rising in your hands, you're not just talking about the craft of fiction, you're describing the preservation of a specific kind of human gravity. And in a world that feels increasingly weightless, where words are generated by probability rather than pulse, I think that your metaphor of the aging weightlifter suggests that our strength is still there, but let's call it the gym, the space for sustained imaginative attention, is being systematically dismantled by a high-stakes identity swap, let's call it this way, I'm quoting you, simultaneous machinification of humans and humanization of machines. So I really wish to keep this reference to physicality and materiality as the framework for my comments to your piece. With AI, we have transcended the binarism, man versus machine. AI is not actually an enemy that comes from outside. It cannot be considered an entity, we can say, separate from us. Rather, it is practically a distillation of the human collective archive. I'm speaking as a humanist, so whoever is a specialist in AI here or away from us can probably cringe, but this is my modest approach to this issue that is pervasive, but influencing different disciplines in different ways. And so precisely this entanglement of AI and individuals forces us to move our inquiry past utility, a question like, what can AI do? And rather confront the existential question, which is also the leitmotif of our session: who do we want to remain? Who should we be? Our species, we can argue, is defined by resistance. Again, moving on, continuing with your metaphor, we are creatures that find meaning in the effort of thought. Therefore, I think AI poses an existential threat, not so much in the sense that machines will learn from us, rise up and delete us. Rather, the danger is probably what I would define the seduction of ease, which is implicit in your argumentation. The risk that we will voluntarily edit ourselves out and gradually delegate our agency to AI and become too much like AI. If we outsource our thinking to large language models, our creative expression to generators, and our social needs to bots, we risk a cognitive and emotional atrophy. We lose muscle memory, right? So, in my view, if we define intelligence, and this was also one of the doubts you had at the beginning, is AI really intelligent? If we define intelligence by the ability to calculate, to strategize, and to process information, then arguably mankind has already lost to the machine, but decades ago, well before the current AI boom. But if we shift our perspective away from sheer logic, what remains distinctively human isn't computational power, but what I would call embodied wisdom. AI supposedly can provide answers, but only a human can understand why a question mattered in the first place. AI can process data without skin in the game. It can tell you the statistical probability of grief, but it has never felt the hollow ache of a loss. So our humanity, in my view, lies not in our productivity, but in our presence. And so this takes me to what you, Mohsin, foreground as the centrality of literary attention. And I wish to comment on the noun first, so attention, then move to the very important adjective, right? So there is a physical quality in the etymology of attention that we can see as intimately connected with our humanity as embodied presence. In Latin, to pay attention, ad tendere means to stretch yourself towards something. And when you are extending your mental and emotional energy across the gap between you and the object of your focus, you aren't just a passive observer. You literally care. You care for this someone or for this something, as in the English verb to tend, right? So at its core, I would say human care is the deliberate application of attention over time, anchored by a full embodied presence. To care for something, whether an object, an idea, or a person, is, let's say, to honor its singularity. And this process is inherently inefficient because it requires slowness and a non-optimized connection. It is within this very friction, and I really like to use the term friction because it really evokes this contact of substances of materiality, that meaning is forged. The history of how a thing or a relationship was made, the labor of its becoming, and the story behind it are what give it ontological weight. In opposition to this stands the frictionless output of AI. We are currently witnessing a shift towards a form of reckless, and I mean, I want to use the term consumerism, really, because it's really a consumerism of information, where the output is delivered at lightning speed, perfectly mirrored to our expectations. And this, in my view, creates a cycle of instant gratification, a term that is probably inflation in our world, but I really see this as the case. And this instant gratification bypasses the human need for process. And so this brings me to the adjective literary that you, Mohsin, adopt to qualify the particular kind of creative attention required by novels, and we could argue the kind of engagement fostered by the humanities more extensively. Homo sapiens may not go totally extinct with AI, but rather evolve into a hoarder of data, of patterns, and of know-how. However, we risk the extinction of, let's call it Homo poeticus. The issue of poetry and poeticity came up in the previous meetings we had. So Homo poeticus as the creative individual able to make new meaning where there is none. And I'm wondering whether the discussion we had this morning about natality as a kind of generative process can also set up an opposition between making something from nothing, or almost so, and the notion of generative in the sense of AI. AI is a predictive engine, a knowing machine. It is always full of information. It's full. It always has a statistically probable answer ready for us. It cannot choose to be stupid. It cannot choose to go back to square one, or it cannot choose to be slow to find a deeper truth. But human creativity has a quality of emptiness that works in a different way, a quality of nothingness. I would go so backwards as to refer to otium, no? The idea of otium in the Roman culture, which is a productive nothingness to the point that negotium, so an action, is a negation of otium, right? And so this emptiness in a creative way is not sterile hollowness, but rather a form of foundational, productive not knowing. I would call it a sort of uncolonized space of silence that allows imagination and thought to struggle, to fail, and ultimately emerge away from the suffocating smartness of common sense and the noise of automated certainty consensus. Yesterday, Fado Spadaro reminded us about the beautiful image in Emily Dickinson, dwelling in possibilities, and you proposed the opposite notion of probability. I found it was a spark that I thought perfect for the session on AI. You know, we humans have the unique agency to be intentionally divergent, to reject the optimized path of AI in favor of the errant path along which we may lose ourselves. Probing, experiments, imaginative labor, transformations are precisely the characteristics of human meaning creation as a sort of thick, situated experience. Yielding to AI's monodimensional, homogeneous production of contents may be welcomed as democratic, but actually does not make us free at all, because it erodes this irreducible, non-linear depths of human subjectivity. So digitization is not a neutral process, it's rather an exercise of power. Veronica was mentioning the fascistization. When we happily relinquish data, we are conforming, right? And we can continue the discussion in that respect. So for all these reasons, I think we have a great responsibility towards new generations who, I would say, unlike us of a certain age, who had the benefit, at least, of a traditional, let's call it analogic education, that is able to provide us a yardstick, not to assess the validity of AI output, the limitations, and the lack of validity as well. New generations of students do not have the ability to perceive, for instance, the inherent partiality of this digital archive, which is also a normalizing operation. So they mistake it for the entire human territory, as though anything that is not tagged, digitalized, scanned, could cease to exist. They don't know the oral archive. They don't know information about other cultures that do not have access to this alternative reality. So they lose primary contact with the material and act, I would say, since you deal with authorships and in novel production, more as orchestrators than as authors. And this is a sort of epidemic shrinking that is the antithesis of the heavy lifting of the mind that for you, Mohsin, should become the baseline from which to stretch even further. So I would say this is not just lowering the ceiling, it's even eroding the very ground of the floor upon which it is built. This is why, and probably you guess where I'm going, why the humanities have never been so important. They shouldn't be considered a luxury of the past. They're actually the sanctuary of our future, the space where we can practice the art of being stubbornly, and I would say even beautifully, unprogrammable. It's a space where, and again, we had Hannah Arendt this morning, forgive this probably bold connection, but immediately when I was preparing this piece, I thought of the opposition between acting and behaving, correct me if I'm wrong, in Hannah Arendt, right? So Hannah Arendt's distinction between action as the highest, free, and unpredictable human activity that reveals a uniqueness of identity versus the sort of predictable and conformist, degrading behavior of which the machine, precisely as a behavioral, as an ultimate behavior, is the embodiment. So, as a concluding thought and food for thought for our discussion, we have to recognize that in the age of AI, there is a kind of sadistic pleasure in discarding humanists as dinosaurs. But I prefer to define as humanists as Cassandras, okay? Visionaries whose warnings may go unheeded, not because we are cumbersome relics of the past, but because we are too far ahead, perhaps, of our time in seeing where we're going, okay? So, this panel and this event is also much about what can we do. It is up to us to reclaim our weight, no pun intended, not as dead weight or stagnant burdens, but as a renewed critical mass that is forged through innovation. We must flex our intellectual muscles and carve a more central presence of the humanities and of all the wonderful ingredients that you isolated in your talk, both in curricula and in public life. And just as we have embraced slow food to protect the palate and slow fashion to protect the environment, maybe we must embrace the gravitas of the humanities as the slow movement of the mind, as a sort of vital resistance against the weightless acceleration of the digital void. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and thank you for so much, but especially for enlarging at least my sense of attention from beyond something receptive and about being present into the realm of, let's say, of mutual aid, of reaching, stretching, tending, and caring. Go ahead.
So I didn't prepare the beautiful text like Nicoletta, so I stay here. But, it's good. I'm shorter. I'm more provocative, make it my points very sharp. So my point that after reading your text, Mohsin, is basically this. Are we really declining? I don't think so. I don't think the students in Doha agrees with you. They feel even like offended. They are like being like, you guys, your generation is stupid because of AI, blah blah blah. So I think we shouldn't be so pessimistic. And let's be honest. You use AI, don't you? I do. I become honest. I do use regularly AI. Do you?
No, not really.
Not really. Okay. Maybe then that's a different story. But I think that my problem is often that the people, critics, philosophers complain about AI, but they use it too. So it's a little bit hypocritical, right? They say, oh, as a professor, I also have to say don't use AI too much, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, I go back to my office and then use it. So I think that's not a very good way of dealing with, new technology and also dealing with other students and so on. And the other problem is, I think, we are supposed to be not only critical, but also creative, because we have to open up the hope for new futures. And the problem is often the progressives today are becoming rather conservative. Oh, this technology might be dangerous. This is bad. I have also this tendency, so this is also self-critique. But when we become so conservative about the new technologies and the possibilities, who is filling out this space of future technologies and future different futures? I think tech rights people, right? These are the places. Conservative people usually, or used to be, much more anti-technology because they want to stick to tradition, and then left-wing progressives are demanding revolution, right? But today, the left-wing, including myself, is demanding degrowing and protect the current way of living by reducing carbon footprint and so on. So I think there is the difficulty to simply warning against new technologies. So I think while admitting the danger and threats, we also play with these new possibilities that AI is now bringing about. So I think one of the possibilities is, once Marx said in the communist society, in the morning we hunt, in the afternoon we fish, and in the afternoon, at night we become like critics and so on, right? And AI is in that sense really maybe preparing that kind of new condition finally. And also AI is preparing the new conditions for finally making the socialist planning possible. Right? In the 1920s, Hayek, Otto Neurath, and for Mises, they had this debate. And then in Russia at that time, they had only primitive computers. It didn't work out. But that doesn't mean that the planning as such is totally impossible. I think rather today, the market coordination is really failing. So maybe with these new technologies, we can imagine a more efficient production, of course, but also more efficient allocations of resources without falling into like this kind of bureaucratic top-down surveillance society. So I think these are like really also an opportunity for the left and the progressives to imagine kind of like a participatory democracy and socialist planning that also become much more efficient, sustainable, and just. But the reality is, of course, the AI is not behaving like that. Rather, as Mohsin rightly pointed out, it's really distracting us from thinking in a more autonomous way, and we are losing our attention, focus, and imaginative capacities, and so on. But my point is basically, as a socialist or Marxist, I don't think that the AI is intrinsically bad, like other technologies. AI is bad because of capitalism, to put it in a very simple way. Because AI is today utilized, as Mohsin pointed out, used for the sake of accumulating profit or rent for a few people. It is not democratically governed. It is not, exposed to the more transparent accountabilities and so on. Rather, this is becoming the machines for making profit and rent. But that doesn't mean that it is not possible to transform AI into some more democratic machine. I think we should socialize. So basically, my conclusion is basically socialize Google, socialize Amazon. How? Of course, through class struggle. But my point is, imagining a different kind of relations of production and distribution is also tightly linked to these new possibilities of using AI. And then after that point, I'm not saying that then maybe in socialism, AI become more democratized and we have more capacity to solve issues of production and allocation. That doesn't mean that AI will solve all the problems. Rather, I think that AI can gather various data, as Nicoletta said, and then still we have to choose. The AI say plan A is like this, plan B will be like this. The plan A you work less, but you have fewer resources, like fewer computers, fewer cars, but maybe more nature. Plan B, you have more automation, but you have to work more, and then environmental pollution is a little bit worse. And so AI cannot decide A or B is better or worse. It is still we collectively decide which plan that AI offers is ideal for us. And that's democracy. But AI doesn't deny democracy. I still think that AI is a condition for a new democracy. But what hinders this possibility is capitalism.
Thank you, Koei. And let's just let it rip from here. But I want to point out that in your response, Moxon detected a decline in human and distinctly literate attention, and then you shifted in your rejoinder to progress in social organization. So it's a kind of apples and oranges comparison that you're making. And also, what would you say to Nicoletta's questions about what AI is doing for the physical qualities of our attention and engagement with others? That's just two questions that emerged from my listening. But would you like to respond first, Moxon?
Yeah, either way. So I think to sort of unite the conversation, to the first point, the notion that AI is a powerful machine is one that I will completely accept. And as a powerful machine that it can do much good is also something that I believe in. So nothing that I said should be interpreted as not saying those things. Then there is the question of, there's a generational question, which we can come to. Is it insulting to the young to speak as I've spoken? I'll come to that. There's also the question that you raised about the realization of socialism through AI. And I think that in terms of distributing resources and having the quote-unquote free market do so, and having a very efficient algorithm do so, I agree that we are looking at something quite interesting. That are there perhaps more efficient ways of distributing resources through a central AI mechanism? I think it's a very interesting question. I think related to that is another very interesting question, which is, given this incredibly powerful machine, where do we wish control over that machine to reside? And ideally, we would like people, the population, to have control over that machine. And the mechanism by which populations can have control over that machine is likely to be the state, which means that if you were to have a model which is AI existing inside a very strong state apparatus, whether it be socialist or something like China, one could imagine that flourishing much more than AI existing in a completely privatized, free market, rent-seeking environment. But there are so many topics here that we could get into that I can only surf on the surface of all of them. But the one that I wanted to sort of dive into has to do with, in a sense, to the next generation. And the idea of, is the view that I articulated somehow insulting to the young? To my mind, it isn't. And I'm not someone who uses AI. I mean, or certainly not in a conscious way. I'm basically, if it shows up on a Google search, I suppose I see it. But as a novelist, my mode of engaging with the world is not necessarily to practice every craft and then to speak about that craft from the status of a practitioner, but rather to observe other people practicing their craft and then to speak about, in a sense, my creative and empathetic reading of what I've seen. So even though I don't have much firsthand experience of the use of AI, I experience it in a couple of different dimensions. One is my children's use of it. And what I find is that it is incredibly helpful to them in many ways of research. I also think that, particularly for neurodivergent children, dyslexic children, children with, quote unquote ADHD, accessing knowledge through AI and having structuring through AI can be quite an interesting assist to one's capacities. But really, for any young person, it clearly has this potential. However, against this, what I would say is that when a powerful machine arrives, and AI is a powerful machine, certain things can be observed. So, for example, when you have the mass arrival of the automobile, a very powerful machine, and everybody starts driving around, very quickly you observe people becoming quite unfit. They get weaker in their cardiovascular strength. They get weaker in their ability to walk a certain distance. And then a generation later, they begin going to the gym fanatically. They drive everywhere. But when they're not driving, they're working out like crazy, and they sort of are able to take advantage of the car, but also be more fit than ancient hunter-gatherers at the same time. I think that, in a sense, we are in maybe the moment between that, those two things. When I teach at university sometimes, I volunteer in the spring at a university in Lahore and teach a half dozen classes as part of that. It's a writing class. I observe these young people and how they approach writing. And what I have had to do to make these classes effective is to radically shrink the length of text that they are allowed to produce. That instead of writing a short story, 3 short stories in a semester, that proves to be too much. Now we've reduced it to 3 500-word pieces of short fiction. Because only by compressing the size of the text to that level can one ask the young people to give the kind of rigor and focused attention required. If I had more time with them, I would work to expand that text and do longer text the next semester and work my way up. But I think what I'm trying to say is that is not that it is some sort of insult to the young, in the same way that if one suddenly has an infinite amount of calories, gaining weight would be expected. You would then have to develop your own mechanisms of controlling how much you eat, et cetera, which human populations have had to do. So what I would say is that I think that AI has the paradoxical effect of allowing people to permit their attentional volition and strength to atrophy. And what I'm simply arguing is that we should not dismiss the power of this thing, we should not underestimate the next generation, but we should actively be working to strengthen their attentional capacities so they can do things with AI far more than what I can do with, or if I did, far more than people of my generation could do. And the last thing I'll say on this, just to conclude, is the people who can get the most out of the automobile. If you look at Formula One drivers are some of the most physically fit people on planet Earth. Why? Because to take that machine to its ultimate capacity, they actually require a supremely athletic level of physical strength. So I suppose what I'm arguing for is not against AI, but in favor of the far more attentionally strong human who can then use AI in its best possible way. That's what I'm trying to argue for.
Nicoletta?
Thank you, Mohsin. I'll be glad to elaborate a little bit more also on your comment on... out of curiosity, I wanted to see, I'm very, very transparent. I inserted the paper topics I chose for my class and see how the machine would reply. And so far, I have to say that the level is not very satisfactory. And this is what I explain to my students. Sometimes you think you can really outsource your creativity to a machine, but at the moment, not yet. Let's say not yet. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball to see how fast the programs will evolve at the moment. And so this gets me to my way of complementing what Mohsin said. So clearly, what you have shown us is that there is an applicability of AI, and many sectors may benefit from it. Nobody's here to deny possible good applications. In any case, whether we like it or not, AI is here to stay, right? But if we move from the level of utility in certain areas and go closer to the activities that we humanists are trying to, I don't want to talk about preserving, but we really believe in them. We think they're fundamental to our humanity and especially important elements that younger generations need to stick to. We realize that if we reason not in terms of class, right, but in terms of disciplines, in areas where critical thinking, originality, imagination, creativity are the means and the end, if we spend time focusing on the machine and what the machine can do as opposed to what a novel can do in the classroom, I think we're not doing a good service to students. So, as in the case of Mohsin, certainly I was not implying that new generations should feel insulted by our trepidation for what may be ahead if we do not complement the existence of these tools with a series of guidelines and opportunities for new generations to believe in their ability to develop in an original way critical thinking, analytical skills that are able to help them appreciate what is out there, to preserve our humanity, appreciate the beauty of a tradition, and being able to create themselves. So it's more a matter of worrying because generations that are born into a digital age do not have, as I said, the privilege of an education that probably, because it was deprived of these tools, was able to give probably a better rounded vision of all that is out there, or maybe tools that are helpful to them to develop their own voice as opposed to borrowing and orchestrating, as I said, as managers, things that have been produced by ourselves, right? But in a way that just mirrors and simulates what creativity could be. So it's really a matter of having a more complex and complete vision of what a human being can do and be.
Go ahead. And then we'll go to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think one point that I didn't elaborate on is this, obviously, the tension between what I said today and what I wrote in previous books, because I am advocating for degrowth, and degrowth is often considered as more like anti-technology, living in nature, go back to nature. And so I often get, why do you use AI and stuff? But I think degrowth is not necessarily anti-technology. Also recognizing how much energy and resources today's AI uses. It's kind of stupid to assume that this is going to be somehow sustainable in the future. I think just this competition among Chinese and American AI companies will simply consume so much electricity, and that's really water too. Yes, so there's all those data centers and clouds are really kind of stupid, because in the end, what we are doing with these AI is just making some cartoons and asking stupid questions like, when does this shop opens, like Antonio does. You're losing a lot of electricity and water because of your stupid questions. And so in that sense, I think we still have to think about degrowing AI. So there's tension. We need these technologies to create a more somehow efficient and more, human, free society. But at the same time, we also have to sort of degrow, or we need some kind of digital degrowth to stay within the planetary boundaries. I don't know how much we can use AI. I don't know what's the way to restrict. As Mohsin expressed, the concern is the state kind of controls, or you use 2 hours of AI, so you're not allowed to use. Does that really offer a good solution? I'm not sure. So I think there are many questions that are still open, but I don't have an answer, so I stop here.
Thank you. Questions, Father Spadaro, and then Daniel.
I've got the mic, so I'll start. I guess my question is about specifically the application, as Mohsin and Nicoletta focused on, of AI to writing, as opposed to other possibilities, some of them potentially revolutionary or liberatory, some of them quite stupid. I'm curious to know what you all think the potential efficacy of AI as an assistant to writing could be. To put my cards on the table, I find it like abhorrent and fundamentally objectionable and completely opposed to the meaning of writing and the purpose of writing, which is to communicate a human idea from one person to another person. And I wonder if, in my sort of perhaps professionally informed opposition to a machine that threatens to render much of our economic activity irrelevant, if I'm missing something about what potentially AI could possibly provide to a writer, aside from, sort of tedious tasks like research or like writing a memo or whatever. Like, what is the vision that AI could do? Like Garry Kasparov wrote once that the best chess player was a combination of a person using Deep Blue to inform him of what moves to make. And that's interesting, but what is the point of chess? It is not to win the game of chess. It is to learn how to play chess. So, like, what do you think AI can do for writers?
We have a writer with us.
It's so I don't I don't really use AI, and it reminds me of a question, when I speak to students, and they start asking about being a writer, and I tell them that a writer isn't someone who has published books. A writer is somebody who writes. If you write every day or if you write frequently, that is the practice of writing. Now, could one publish more books by using AI? Possibly. I mean, almost certainly, I guess. But I think that that for me, writing is something very different. And even if my own approach to writing, in the sense of when I often am working on a novel, if I've written a draft, I will begin the next draft with a blank, Word document. I'll have already written a draft. I'll know that draft. It's there in my head. But to not be constrained by what I've written before, I try to write it again. And I find that writing it again without constraint, but with the knowledge of one attempt, is very helpful. So I think the empty page is a wonderful thing for a writer to encounter. Now, what I think AI can do is it can fill that page for you. You can revise it. You can do many things for it. But my own feeling about it is that it is best not used for that. So I don't think AI is some useless thing for writers necessarily. It might be quite useful in ways that I don't fully understand. But I think that to be a writer is also to be an instrument for writing. And then the question is, how do you tend to that instrument? How do you make your instrument as finely attuned and capable of writing as possible? That's why I was speaking of these things, in a sense, strengthening that instrument. I actually think that the human instrument of the writer has to be much stronger in the time of AI. We're constantly having our attention stolen from us. We're having all these things going on. So to achieve a state of really focusing, of being able to bear with things, and writing a novel for me is a 7-year-long thing. It's not a quick activity. So for those of us who are engaged in the slower human tasks, I think we have to be stronger. So I suppose my answer to you is not to dismiss AI's potential for it, but really, I find it harder to be a writer now. Not just because of AI, which I don't use directly, but because, of course, the algorithms that I do encounter are constantly tapping into my attention. I find it much harder to sustain attention, to be volitional about attention, to maintain states of attention. And if I'm finding it harder, I can only imagine that other people are finding it harder. And I see it in students, for example. I see it in what I would observe as a decline in the quality of the median essay at the best universities in the world, now compared to when I first saw those essays, 30 years ago. I'll leave it there, but my own sense of it is that the writer today has a task even more at odds with the stance of society than it was when I began writing, which means that writers today have to be stronger than they were when I began writing. And how do you become stronger as a writer? I personally don't think that AI is the way to do that. You will need to be much stronger to be a writer in the era of AI. But it's a much longer thing. I'll leave it to you to also. Yeah.
Thank you. Very personal answer. You say, do you use AI? If it's a matter of utilitarian use of writing, I can understand why certain people may refer to that. I tried, for me, adjectives are very important. Remember, I write in English, but I'm Italian, and for me, adjectives and verbosity are the sunshine of life. Padre Spadaro gives me his blessing, so I feel safe. Okay, so I tried very recently. Georgetown gave us access to this Gemini, which is still a kind of strange thing for me. I wanted to try. And so I was looking for synonyms because I'm obsessed by repetitions where they're not intentional. And I'm very, very tough. I don't like the synonyms that I'm given. So I find it very useless because I don't find what I want. In the end, maybe I end up finding my own adjective just to differentiate myself from what the artificial intelligence is proposing to me. So we're going to the issue of voice. I cannot be satisfied, not that I'm doing this out of purpose, out of curiosity. I haven't found anything that can really help me, and I think I wasted a lot of time. Now, the other thing, I tried to see whether, again, out of curiosity, it was possible to have an abstract of an article I had just written. I couldn't recognize myself. There was nothing that, in my view, was my thesis statement, and there was nothing that could really retain the main points and the transitions that I was looking for in a synthesis of my 40-page article. Why do I say this? Because if all this boils down to what our students can do, at the moment, what I see when, and it's obviously detectable, students use AI, is a bad copy of what they could do with some perseverance, believing in themselves. And once they're prisoners of what the machine gives them, they are lost in that mechanism, and they really have a problem going back to the white, to the blank slate, to the white page that you were referring to. It's very difficult to deprogram yourself when you're a prisoner of a certain jargon. This is what I can say from my very limited experience. Maybe you have another way of relating to this tool, because it is a tool.
I kind of disagree with that we have to be stronger writer in the age of AI, because now we have Google Map, so we cannot read maps, but it's fine, right? And then we will have automatic driving, so we don't need a driver's license. But then we can be good writer without becoming a strong writer. And, being a strong writer was such a privileged thing. So maybe everyone can be a writer, everyone can drive a car. So I think both are good things, and it's not necessarily something that we should lament.
We have a pretty less than 5 minutes. A quick question from Father Spadaro.
A quick question is complicated to make a quick
Yes,
question.
but you're good at distilling
I'm
it.
very good at that. Yeah, usually I don't use machines, AI. I use it just for checking when a shop open, as you told me before. But I don't use them. I dialogue with them. I dialogue with machines. And I think I don't use them. I dialogue with them. I think this is the real challenge we have now. We don't know how to dialogue with them. And I want to quote here a saint. I'm a priest, so I can quote a saint, which is Saint Paul VI, a pope, who wrote this in 1964, which means 2 years before I was born.
He or one of his aides wrote it. Right.
Science, yeah, exactly. Science and technology are becoming brothers once more, not only offering us this marvel, but also providing us with a glimpse of new mysteries. It's enough for us to appreciate how this very modern service is being put to the use of culture, as though the mechanical brain is coming to the aid of the spiritual brain. And the more it is able to express itself in its own language, the more it ceases to enjoy being relied upon. It's not this effort to infuse mechanical instruments with the semblance of spiritual functions that has made them more noble and exalted by a task that touches the sacred. Isn't that incredible? That was written 2 years before I was born. So he speaks, St. Paul VI speaks about the mechanical brain which is coming to the aid of the spiritual brain. He was kind of a prophet, but I want also to quote, I don't know if you feel strange, sense of prophecy that he had.
It depends on whether you think he's right, Father Spadaro.
I think it's right. I think it's right. And also I want to quote, since I have 2 minutes. No?
I think you have 1 minute, yes.
Another guy, a Jesuit, who is a saint for me, is Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin made a comparison with the optics and photography that within the span of a century have become the natural extension of our sight. But just as they have extended our vision, they didn't make us blind. So having photography and optics didn't make us blind. So the machines of thought can extend our cognitive capacity without rendering us inert. So we have to deal with this challenge. I think it's a big challenge. We have the possibility to liberate a new mass, this is Teilhard, a new mass of psychic energy immediately transformable into still higher forms of understanding and imagination. So we are still struck by what are experiencing a machine which writes as we do. So they look like us. So the real question is, who am I? Since this machine here is able to think like me and to write like me. So this is the real question. So we are kept by this shock we are living now. But we have to deal with it because it has a spiritual meaning. Stop talking about ethics. Start talking about spirituality. I don't care about the ethics of the algorithm or how to use well artificial intelligence, since we still don't know what we are talking about.
Thank you to everyone who's viewing the live stream. Thank you to everyone here. We have a hard ending and hard out right now, but we can continue the conversation over coffee and as we go to the next session. Thank you.